Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this installment of Epic Insight. This is Brian Lenz, Director of Sales and Strategic Partnerships here at Epic Retirement Plan Services, and I'll be your host for today's call. We're excited to be joined by Ben Rizzuto of Janus Henderson to give us an update on the latest and greatest in the defined contribution plan world, with the hope that you can use some of his insight and findings within your practices. Ben is a retirement director at Janus Henderson, and in that role, he works with advisors to develop solutions to increasingly difficult retirement issues. He also serves as the host of their Plan Talk podcast and is a contributor to the Janus Henderson blog. Prior to joining Janus in 2014, he worked as a business development consultant for Jackson National Life, and he holds a BA in political science from the University of Colorado and an MBA from the University of South Carolina. In addition, he holds Series 7 and 66 licenses and the Chartered Retirement Plan Specialist designation. As always, your line will be muted throughout the call, but if you have any questions that you want Ben or I to discuss at the end of the webinar, feel free to enter those in the questions panel. And also, this session is eligible for CE, so Ben will give you some details on that to make sure you get your credits. With that, we'll turn it over to Ben.
Super. Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking some time to be with us today to go through, as Brian mentioned, the latest and greatest when it comes to the defined contribution and retirement plan marketplace. We're going to be doing that through going through a piece that we put out on a quarterly basis, our top DC trends and developments guide. If you're not familiar with this piece, obviously it's something we put out on a quarterly basis that we feel quite strongly about. We feel that it really provides advisors, consultants, and investment committee members with highlights and important updates from the defined contribution marketplace. And I always say that by going through this, it allows you or those that you work with to keep their finger on the pulse of that which is going on at the plan, the participant, the legal, and regulatory levels. So as we get started, you can see that there are 6 sections to the guide: quarterly highlights, participants corner, legislative review, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to keep my comments to about 45 minutes or so we'll skip over a few slides, but know that as a follow-up to this presentation, everyone on the call will get a copy of the slides, as I think you'll be hard-pressed not to find at least one thing within them that is going to be of interest to you. Also, as Brian mentioned, we will be offering continuing education credit. I believe when you registered that you provided your information, but if you have any questions on that, I'll provide my contact information at the end of today to make sure that you get the credit that you deserve. And then also keep those questions, as we'll take some time at the end to answer any that you may have. But let's go ahead and jump in, and we'll start with our quarterly highlights section. And within this section, the way I think is best to view it is as a best practices section. What we're doing within the section of this guide here is we are providing updates on improvements that companies have made to their plan, or we're looking at high-level trends that give you some ideas as to the best practices that companies are implementing. One other thing before I forget, remember this is a quarterly piece. The sections stay the same in that there's always a quarterly highlights section, but remember the information within that turns over 100%. So we think that it's important to get a copy of it on a quarterly basis because there's always something fresh and new in it. So without further ado, let's jump into these best practices. And this quarter, what we did is we highlighted the majority of this section to Plan Sponsor Magazine's 2019 Best in Class 401k Plan winners. As you can see, there's a number of names on this page, 34 winners in all. The plans range from the relatively small $24 million plans all the way up to the very, very large, and that you've got over some plans that have over $3 billion within them. Now, the winners the names, those are interesting, but I think these lists can always be helpful because it can give you an idea of what the best plans out there are doing. And you can see the criteria the plan sponsor uses. They use 35 criteria overall related to plan design, oversight, governance, and participant outcomes to rate these plans. So over the next several slides, we'll see what these best practices and what these high-level trends are that I think you all should be concerned with when it comes to the plans that you're working with. And if nothing else, the next several slides will serve as a very quick, very easy benchmarking survey that you can take plan sponsors through. First, we'll look at plan measures, and these are the plan measures that I think many of us are concerned with. Overall, you can see, and as you would expect, best-in-class plans have higher participation, higher deferral rates, and this leads to higher retirement confidence. Now, the question always comes up, well, what does retirement confidence mean? What this means is that plan sponsor asks companies, business owners, plan sponsors, whether they agree with the statement, most of our employees will achieve their retirement goals by age 65. And they're provided an agreement scale ranging from agree to disagree. And that figure is the percentage that agree or somewhat agree with that statement. So we can see that retirement confidence is up. 39% of plan sponsors agree or somewhat agree that their employees will meet their retirement goals by age 65. Obviously, all other plans had a lower rate of retirement confidence. And I think that's a great stat, that's a great trend, but the question to really ask ourselves is, do participants feel that same level of confidence? So I think that really is a reason to reach out to participants and make sure that they're feeling as optimistic as plan sponsors are feeling. Next, I want to touch on investment choices. You can see the figures on the screen here. The one thing that I wanted to point out is with Roth. Roth provisions were 97% this year. That's actually up from 87% of best-in-class plans last year. And that's all fine and good, but as we know, there's offering Roth and there's people using Roth. So 97% of best-in-class plans may offer it, but as you may know, only about 20% of participants use that Roth provision. So I think that really begs the question, how can we get folks to use this option more often? Is it a matter of educating them as to the possible tax benefits of using this option, or is it simply reminding them that Roth is an option within the plans that you work with? And I think many times, a lot of things like Roth or the match or something like that, we view those as common knowledge, but it may not be as common knowledge-wise as we think when it comes to participants. So reminding participants what's available, I think, is the takeaway here. Looking at plan design, auto-enrollment increased from 98% to 100% between 2018 and 2019. And actually more of the all other plans were using auto-enrollment as well. Along with that, the idea of loan payment post-separation. This is a topic that we've talked about over the past couple of quarters in this guide. And we see here that 56%, in fact, of best-in-class plans are offering this option. That's actually down from 65% last year. So the thing to remember with loans is that those are a plan asset, and there is some fiduciary responsibility associated with them. And even though there may be some administrative headaches or issues to consider and think about when it comes to offering folks the ability to pay loans post-separation, that may be an option to at least consider. We've seen not only 56% of best-in-class plans offering it, but other companies as well. Let's see, we didn't see a lot of change when it comes to employer contributions. Moving on to oversight and governance practices. This is, of course, always interesting. First, looking at investment committees. 100% of best-in-class plans have one. Same percentage as last year. But interestingly, the figure of other plans that have an investment committee actually dropped. And that's dropped over the last 3 years, going from 95% in 2017 all the way down to 73% this year. Also, the percentage of all other plans that have an IPS, investment policy statement, went from 77% last year down to 67% this year. So I think that is interesting because, as we know, it doesn't matter if you are a small plan or a large plan or a best-in-class plan or a quote-unquote all other plan. We all have some level of fiduciary responsibility. So how can we make sure that plan sponsors are meeting that fiduciary duty and responsibility by possibly implementing one of these investment committees or using an investment policy statement? The final area studied is financial education. And overall, I think the main line item to look at here is the percentage of companies that offer no financial education. That's the last line item on the slide. Only 6% of best-in-class plans offered nothing. Put another way, 94% of best-in-class plans offer some form of financial education. Now, looking more specifically, we saw more best-in-class plans offering education on savings and budgeting, as that was at only 74% last year, up to 94% this year. Investing basics, that increased about 20% as well. Overall, I think the point to take from this slide is that plan sponsors' definition of financial education or what should be included in a financial wellness program, that may differ, but if you want to work towards being a better plan, you really need to consider offering something to your plan participants. So those are the 7 categories or so that were in the plan sponsor best-in-class survey for this year. Again, a lot of good metrics. I think a lot of very interesting talking points to bring to the attention of the plan sponsors that you are working with. The other thing that we do in this section is we typically highlight some specific companies that have made changes to their plans that have helped improve participation or engagement or savings rate or something like that. Here you can see the 3 that we touch on this quarter. And then for the sake of time, I'm going to skip forward to Eileen Fisher. She's the last one that we list here. And there are a couple things that I think are important to take from this slide. First, note that the investment committee actually wanted to increase the plan's exposure to ESG, environmental, social, and governance funds, kind of the next step in socially responsible investing. Now, the plan already had 4 ESG funds on its menu, but it was interested in actually evaluating those funds and perhaps adding others. Now, one thing that I think is incredibly important with this idea is that the committee members realized that they needed guidance in doing this. They realized that they did not have the expertise to do this, so they reached out to an advisor or an advisory firm. Now, to do this, they began a search for an advisor that had expertise in the ESG investing space. Since they found that there's a whole host of funds that are considered socially responsible, and the definition, as you may know, is pretty broad. Now, to do this, they went through a company called InHub. And this is an online request for proposal management technology company. And through this RFP, 6 firms were invited to submit proposals online. And by doing so online, this allowed the committee members to actually review the proposals using a shared, centralized document with side-by-side comparisons that enabled reviewers to make notes, flag points, and ask additional questions. From there, they hired an advisory group that brought in an in-depth research on the ESG approach for the funds that were part of the plan menu, as well as brought in some ideas about things they should review and consider. So like I said, a couple things to take away here. First and foremost, ESG is something that is gaining a little bit more momentum as far as plan menus are concerned. Secondly, this company called InHub allows you to, it really kind of breaks down some of the geographic barriers that may be in place, in that it allows advisors, advisory firms to submit their proposals for plans wherever they may be, because I believe the company that won this RFP was in a different state than Eileen Fisher, their headquarters overall. So that finishes up the quarterly highlights for this quarter. Again, a number of ideas, a number of best practices that may be good conversation starters with companies that you work with. Next, let's touch on the participant corner. Here, what we're doing is looking at research and insights about the retirement readiness of plan participants and getting an idea of how those participants are behaving, or as we know in many cases, misbehaving within the plan. And I think this section really allows us to get an idea of how participants are feeling, okay? So the first 3 slides in this section touch on the investments within a plan menu. This first one comes from Morningstar, and I think this may be interesting to all of you as you head into your next investment committee meeting. So first, research from Morningstar showed that when defined contribution plans replaced investments in their lineups, there was, as they say, significant evidence that the replacement mutual funds outperformed the original funds over the future 1-year and 3-year periods. Now, more specifically, they found that improvements were made in each of the 4 types of mutual funds: equity, bonds, asset allocation, and the combination of all funds. The largest outperformance occurred in the equity sleeve. Now, while replacement funds in this research were shown to be beneficial to participants, I do not believe that this means that you should go out and automatically just blow up your plan lineup. What I think this really highlights is that plan sponsors must constantly monitor their investment lineups and implement, as well as consistently follow, a common sense due diligence process. Now, the other thing to note here is that the research did not provide guidance on how and when a plan sponsor should decide to replace a fund, but it did recommend the ideas of tailoring investment lineups to a participant or population's demographics, such as participant salary, education level, financial literacy, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, we need to have a common sense due diligence process in place, and I think advisors are the ones that are really going to help plan sponsors follow that process over the long term. Next, I want to touch on the idea of the core menu, okay? And here, actually, we'll touch on QDIA funds. So of the 3 types of QDIA funds, target date funds, target risk or balanced funds, and managed accounts, I think we could all agree that target date funds have become the clear favorite these days. But according to research by Cowen, 91%, and in fact, according to research by Cowen, 91% of plans offer a target date fund. Okay, 85 do so as their default. But even though there's a huge amount of money that is in target date funds, Morningstar here found that there are significantly different rates of default acceptance among the 3 types of target date fund, or excuse me, QDIA funds that I mentioned. It actually turns out that while default acceptance does decrease with age, it's actually the default type that has the greatest impact on the likelihood of default acceptance. And default acceptance basically means that the participant stays invested in that fund or that account. Default acceptance among managed accounts is highest, followed by target date funds, and then followed by balanced funds. And overall, what they found is that it's the level of personalization that's associated with each type of solution that is most important. And since managed accounts can provide the greatest level of personalization, they are considered the stickiest type of QDIA option. So many times when we think about a default fund, we focus on fees, performance, and the overall appropriateness or fit of the default investment solutions. But this really goes into the point of how can we personalize those funds to make sure that folks stay invested in them. All right. Many, I think, have been talking about student loan repayment programs over the past year. And here we see that nearly 1/3 of employers offer or are planning to offer some type of student loan debt or management program. Now, this would include programs like debt consolidation, refinancing, or some type of subsidy that the employer might give to their participants. This slide comes from a report from EBRI entitled How Employers Are Tackling Student Loan Debt. In it, they point out that the percentage of American families with student loan debt has more than doubled since 1992, from 10.5% in 1992 to 22.3% in 2016. Additionally, repayment of this debt can be challenging, as many of us know, as in 2017, 1/5 of those with education debt were behind on their payments. Now, the main reason that employers are focusing on these types of programs is 1, to retain employees, and 2, to reduce employee stress. Finally, employers were asked to estimate the annual cost per employee of offering some type of program. And they said it would be as little as $50 per employee. Now, a couple things that I want to mention here. There's been a lot of talk about these programs, student loan repayment programs, over the past year, specifically because of a private letter ruling that Abbott Laboratories received, which allowed them to provide a match to participants based on their student loan repayments. Now, it's not as if Abbott Laboratories is paying off student loan debt for their participants. They're just allowing them to, they're just really looking at those student loan repayments as if they were salary deferrals. Okay, so that's one thing to note. And also remember that since this is a private letter ruling, it only applies to Abbott Laboratories. So there's been a lot of excitement about this, but no one can really implement that sort of program. That's one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is that a lot of these employers are offering bolt-on programs, after-tax programs, or programs just to help participants figure out how to pay down these loans a little bit quicker. Because what I have found is that in many cases, participants view paying down debt or saving for retirement as an either-or proposition. The question is, how can we make them understand that they really can do both at the same time? Okay. But a lot of excitement, especially from HR folks and benefit folks when it comes to these sorts of programs. All right. Let's see. Here's an interesting one. The National Association of Retirement Plan Participants released its annual Participant Trust and Engagement Study, which shows that overall satisfaction with providers has declined by 24% in the last 6 years. That is a new low. Even more, only 11% of those who took part in the survey trust financial institutions, and only 25% of participants feel that they can always trust their employer. The National Association of Retirement Plan Participants says if participants were to trust their provider more, they would likely defer higher amounts into their retirement plans, be more committed to saving, and have a stronger perception of their provider's brand. Furthermore, they would be more loyal to the provider, which would put providers in a better position to cross-sell products, or if you're the employer, simply retain your employees. So if you think about it, I mean, trust is one of the most fundamental drivers of behavior. because it really allows people to do things that may not necessarily be intuitive to them. So the question that I think all of us really needs to think about is, how can we build greater levels of trust with the folks that we are serving, whether you're a plan sponsor and it's your employees, or a financial institution or a financial advisor and it's your clients. So I think that's a really interesting topic to think about and consider with those that you sit down with. Now, I think many of us would agree that financial literacy in this country needs to be improved. The current retirement plan environment may have something to do with this, since retirement investing in the United States has really changed dramatically. This study that we see here shows that people whose only exposure to investment decisions is by virtue of their participation in an employer-sponsored plan are actually poorly equipped to make sound investment decisions. Specifically, they suffer from higher levels of financial literacy than other investors. This lack of financial literacy is critical, both because of the financial consequences that it holds, and because of the legal structure that relies on participant choice and to limit the fiduciary obligations of the employer. So based on this research, the researchers propose mandated employer-provided financial education to address these financial literacy issues. Plus, they believe that employers should formalize their role in evaluating and increasing financial literacy among plan participants. So definitely something to consider and think about with a plan sponsor. Do they offer financial education? If not, would they like to? If they do, or if they're starting a program, what should that look like? And how can you formalize the education of your participants? Because just them being invested in the 401k does not, as the research points out, lead them to be financially savvy, as it were. All right, let's go ahead and move forward to healthcare. Always an interesting topic. And this is the last slide in this section. Here we're going to take a look at the spending patterns of older households. Specifically, this study here looks at spending to income ratios for different types of households. EBRI found for single and retired individual households, they had a median spending rate higher than median income by $2,800, resulting in a spending to income ratio of 112%. They found that this was the only demographic for which overspending was true, whether respondents were single and in the labor force, married and retired, or married with at least one individual in the labor force. Spending to income ratios were well below 100% for those groups. Married couples with at least one member working had the lowest spending to income ratio among the four groups, with an average of 45% and a median of 57%. Retired couples had an 80% spending to income ratio on average and a median of 86. And as we know, health expenses, of course, steadily grow as people age. So, for example, in 2011, households with at least one member between the ages of 50 and 64 spent 8% of their total budget on health items. That's compared to 19% of that income for those that are 85 and older. So overall, what I think this does is it underlines the idea that a different approach for measuring retirement income adequacy could be merited, as well as the fact that, if nothing else, we just need to educate participants while they're still part of the plan on healthcare expenses and how they can plan for them as they get closer to retirement. All right. Next, we'll touch on a couple of legislative items. Within the legislative review, we're really looking at proposals that are coming out of Washington, D.C., and some that are actually on the state level to be aware of. So nothing imminent, but things to be aware of. First off, I want to touch on the SECURE Act. If this bill is passed in its current form, this would lead to the largest changes in the retirement industry since the Pension Protection Act of 2006. So if there's one piece of legislation that you're going to follow, the SECURE Act may be it. Now, many were very optimistic about this bill after it passed out of the House of Representatives by a stunning vote of 417 to 3. While that is the case, it has currently gotten itself bogged down in the Senate. So the hope is that we'll see some action from Congress once they come back from summer vacation. But a couple of things to note. Number of changes that this bill could lead to. You can see required minimum distribution age would move up to age 72, would increase the automatic escalation safe harbor from 10 to 15% for safe harbor 401ks. It might encourage lifetime income options in DC plans, and it would, as many pieces of legislation, actually increase or make multiple employer plans much more accessible to different types of companies. So like I said, this is currently in the Senate. It's gotten a little bogged down based on some questions around 529 plans. But once Congress comes back from summer vacation, you'll probably hear a lot more about it. Another bill that I wanted to touch on, which links back to something we talked about earlier, is one from Ron Wyden. And just to touch on student loan debt again, EBRI recently said that households headed by a person aged 35 or younger with a college degree and no student loan debt have a median defined contribution account balance of $20,000. That's compared to only $13,000 for similar families that have student loan debt. Like I said, many folks view paying down debt and saving for retirement as an either-or proposition. This bill, which has been reintroduced by Ron Wyden, would help to solve that. It's called the Retirement Parity for Student Loans Act, and it seeks to address the current law stipulation whereby employers can only make a matching contribution to a 401k if an employee is also making contributions. Under the terms of the bill, if a plan chooses to offer this option, it could make matching contributions based on student loan repayments. So this bill would allow all plans to offer what Abbott Laboratories was able to offer through its private letter ruling. So I think there would be great hope for this bill to move forward. So definitely keep your eyes on that one. Now, one final thing that I wanted to touch on is something at the state level. And I'm sure many of you may be dialing in from all across the country. So I wanted to touch on what's going on at the state level, specific to these state-run retirement plans. And here we can see that Pennsylvania and New Jersey have become the latest states to move towards offering their own state-run retirement plans for private sector companies that do not currently offer plans to their employees. So Phil Murphy signed legislation back in March to create the New Jersey Secure Choice Savings Program. Okay. This would be administered by the state and require employers with 25 or more employees to participate, through automatic payroll deductions. Employers with less than 25 employees may participate, but they don't have to. The default contribution rate in the program would be 3%. Implementation of the program is set to begin March 28th of 2021. So for those of you in New Jersey, that is definitely something to think about. Pennsylvania is now looking into if it should establish their own program such as this. They are simply at the task force point in the process. But not only have we seen New Jersey and Pennsylvania going down this road, we've actually seen close to 30 states at least look at or implement legislation when it comes to these state-run retirement plans. As you may know, Oregon was the first state to do this. They started their program, I think it was a year or two ago, and it's up to about $25 million in assets. Illinois is another plan that should be rolling out their program very, very soon. I believe Maryland, Washington, a number of other states have looked into this. And the reason that I think this is important, especially for advisors, is because if you work with business owners that currently do not offer a retirement plan, this trend, the trend of states offering or setting up their own retirement plan programs, prompts the question, if you're a small business owner and you don't have a retirement plan, would you rather set up a retirement plan and be able to customize it and maximize your contributions, not only for yourself as a business owner, but for your participants? Would you rather do that, or would you rather have the state mandate something on you that is one size fits all? And I think in many cases, small business owners may prefer the former versus the latter. Moving on to the regulatory review. One thing that I just wanted to touch on here regarding compensation. Now, the DOL has proposed some changes to overtime rules. And this came in a recent DOL proposal that would increase the salary and compensation levels for workers to be exempt from minimum wage and overtime requirements under the Fair Labor Standards Act. What this would do is it would raise the exemption threshold for the salary level test to $679 per week. For non-highly compensated employees, non-discretionary bonuses and incentive payments could satisfy up to 10% of the test, provided the bonuses are at least paid annually. Overall, and the thing to note here is that the total compensation threshold for highly compensated employees, that level would be increased to $147,000. The reason that I think this is important, in a lot of cases, highly compensated employees aren't going to get overtime, right? They're salaried employees. But the reason that I think this is important, and just a nice note to take to a plan sponsor, is because many times compensation leads to a lot of errors, right? I know CPAs that are always complaining about compensation and the errors that arise with it. So I think this proposal is a good reason to touch base with a plan sponsor and make sure that they are clear on their definition of compensation. Also, it's a good reason to touch base with the payroll provider and make sure that they're sending money where it needs to go and adhering to the definition of compensation, because again, it can be one of those areas where a lot of issues can arise. So that is a good, quick operational check to put in place when it comes to compensation. The fifth section of the guide is our legal review. And for better or worse, there is no shortage of information when it comes to what's going on with plan sponsors in the legal arena. What we do in this section is we provide updates and noteworthy topics when it comes to many of the class action lawsuits or plan sponsors that are being sued when it comes to potential breaches of fiduciary duty. Now, one thing I want to note with this first slide is the Tussey versus ABB case. This is basically an excessive fee lawsuit, but many feel that this is the landmark lawsuit when it comes to class action and ERISA. We saw a settlement finally after 12 years with this case. $55 million was the settlement. And along with that, the settlement requires ABB to conduct a search for record-keeping services, rebate any revenue sharing fees back to plan participants, and employ the loyal selection of 401k investments going forward. Now, this is a billion-dollar plan. It's a huge settlement. But even though that is the case, it provides a number of very important lessons, I think, to plan sponsors and advisors regarding how they select funds, how they choose to map funds when there is a fund replaced from a plan menu, how you need to adhere to your IPS, and a number of different things. So if you're interested in this topic, this idea of class action lawsuits, we have some other content regarding these, what we call fiduciary failures, that I think really helps to shine a light and highlight some of the things, some of the lessons that plan sponsors can take from these class action lawsuits, even though they do deal with very large plans. Now, like I said, these deal with very large plans, and a lot of times I'll talk to plan sponsors or advisors even, and they'll say, you know what, Ben, this isn't an issue that small plans need to worry about. Well, to that, I would retort with this slide. We can see, unfortunately, that these cases are moving downstream. On this slide, we have 4 examples. You can see National Indemnity, that's a $289 million plan, all the way down to this BTG, which is a $63 million plan, right? So these plans or these lawsuits are moving downstream. That's the first thing to note. The second thing to note is the allegations. Many of the same issues that cropped up in the larger lawsuits are cropping up in the smaller lawsuits. Excessive fees, revenue sharing, improper investments, investment policy statement violations. The other thing that I always point out, and I do this because I live in Denver, is the lawyers that are now getting into this field. We here in Denver have a gentleman by the name of Franklin Azar. He has given himself the moniker as the strong arm. He is a personal injury lawyer by trade, but he has now brought 4 lawsuits against plan sponsors, and he has actually won 2 of them already. So the point I always like to make is that if the local personal injury lawyer is now trying his hand and having success with ERISA litigation, what's to stop some other lawyer in whatever town or city you live in from doing the same to the small plans that you work with? So overall, I don't mean to bring this up to scare plan sponsors. I think it just really highlights how you need to keep your eye on the ball. You need to work with competent advisors to make sure that there's an extra set of eyes that are on the plan and making sure that they're meeting those fiduciary responsibilities. A couple of the things that I wanted to point out. The Supreme Court may actually be hearing a couple of 401k lawsuits in the coming months. First, you've got the Jander versus IBM case, and this may not affect a lot of plans that you all are working with, but this could change the precedent set by the Dudenhofer case and provide guidance on the standard for evaluating fiduciaries' action when it comes to company stock. All right, and this really gets down to the idea of these stock drop cases, right? So if your plans that you work with offer company stock, I think the point that I always make is that's perfectly fine. We just need to remember that we need to offer participants the ability to diversify out of it. Because if they have a large portion of their retirement savings in company stock and that company stock goes down for one reason or another, that could definitely hinder their ability to retire comfortably. And like I said, it's led to these stock drop cases. The other case that we list on this slide is the Intel case. That's the second sub-bullet point under the Supreme Court. This one's kind of interesting. It gets into the idea of what's being called actual knowledge. When does a plaintiff have actual knowledge of when an alleged fiduciary breach has occurred? And even though that is, again, one of those terms that we find in ERISA that is muddy at best, what I think this is going to help us do is it's going to help us think about how we communicate with participants and how we help to make sure that they understand the type of information that they are receiving when it comes to the plan and what we are doing within it. One other case on this slide that I think is important, Supreme Court declined to hear the Chevron case. What's interesting about this case is that the allegation was that the plan sponsor did not meet their fiduciary duty because they only provided a money market fund that provided microscopically small returns. That's the language that was in the complaint, not mine, versus offering a stable value fund. That case has been dismissed a couple times at the lower court level. Here we can see the Supreme Court has actually declined to hear that one. So kind of gets into investments that you offer to your plan participants and this idea of money market versus stable value. Okay. So those are a number of things that are going on on the legal front. As I mentioned, there is, of course, no shortage of stuff going on at the legal front. The final section of the guide is our global headlines section. Overall, what we're doing within this section is really just getting an idea of how folks are thinking about retirement around the world. Also, what sort of best practices are being used around the world when it comes to retirement plans. So I'm just, one thing that I'll point out here, just for the last couple of moments, is that in Canada, they found that there was a significant decrease in flows into investment products between the late 2018 and early 2019 periods. This, of course, got those in the financial services industry up in arms and rather concerned. They wanted to figure out why folks were not investing in their products, and they found that they were taking the money and they were actually paying down debt. So what this, I think, points out is a trend that we've seen in the U.S. as well, is that retirement and retirement savings may not be the top priority for folks. They may be more focused on paying down debt. And like I said earlier, I think if we can understand how folks are feeling, like we did in the Participants Corner section, if we can understand how they're feeling, if we can understand what they're prioritizing, then that may help us educate them and keep them engaged with the retirement plans that we work with. So again, this may be something that concerns Canadians, but I think it also really is something that we've seen in the United States as well. So that gives us about 10 minutes for questions. Let me just go ahead and make sure I get through all the slides. As I mentioned, we'll go ahead and make sure to provide an hour of CE credit for all of those of you who took part today. One thing to note with this guide is that not only is it good for CFP and CIMA credit, the credit that those of us financial advisors have, but note that this is also good for CPA, HR, and benefits credit. So if you would ever like to use this guide with your centers of influence, please let us know, because I think it's a great way to educate those folks and make sure that you're providing good value on an ongoing basis. So, Brian, let's go ahead and open up the lines for any questions, or if you have any comments before we do that, feel free.
Yeah, appreciate it, Ben. Thanks for sharing the Janus Henderson update for this quarter. We will send out the deck that Ben walked through along with a recording of this presentation to all of you who attended today and anyone who registered as well. So expect that forthcoming. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to throw those in the GoToWebinar questions panel there. I had a couple that have come in, Ben, and I can share those with you as others come in. One relates back to kind of the best plan features, if you will, or characteristics of the best plans. And you mentioned kind of Roth being a part of that, and that potentially just reminding people that Roth is available might produce an uptake. Do you have any other strategies that you guys have seen effective in analyzing Roth versus traditional, or promoting that? Or are people starting to even think about auto enrollment in Roth depending on demographics? Any comments
Yeah,
around that?
that's where I was going to go with enrollment. As you mentioned, and as we talked about, I think most plans are thinking about or offering Roth. But for example, one company that we highlighted in the guide a couple quarters ago, actually ThyssenKrupp, right, which is the elevator company. What they've done is they are auto-enrolling participants based on their salary. So those participants who make over $50,000, I think that's the line of demarcation, they go into the traditional 401k. Those under $50,000 go into the Roth 401k. So I think that's one way to help with uptake. Also, we would think that those who are making less salary-wise are probably younger. I think most of us would agree that younger folks probably will benefit from going into the Roth side of the 401k sooner rather than later. So that's one way I think that plan sponsors are thinking about how to increase uptake when it comes to Roth.
Okay. You also mentioned a lot about financial education or wellness, as we're talking about in the industry. Are you seeing any causal effect being fleshed out of that? That seems to be a feature in these high-performing plans. Is that simply something that whoever is deciding that it's a high-performing plan should be in there, or is having wellness actually driving better behavior from plan participants?
Yeah.
Is there any delineation between correlation and causation there at this point in time?
Yeah, I think, and I think it was a Willis Towers Watson study. I think financial wellness programs and offering those help to decrease financial stress for employees. And in this Willis Towers Watson study, they looked at participants who were, let's just call it, financially stressed versus not stressed. Those who were financially stressed took more time off from work. They did not perform as well in their jobs. So I think there definitely is a correlation between those plans that offer some sort of program and the behaviors of their participants and the productivity of their participants and probably the overall loyalty of their participants, even though that's probably a longer term study that someone's in the midst of. But I think there definitely is some correlation between providing these programs and how that affects financial stress for employees, and then how that affects the overall productivity of the employee. Now, what you put into your financial wellness program, well, that depends on the company. That's another. We could spend a whole hour talking about what a financial wellness program should look like. Sure. But I think just offering something goes a long way to show participants that the company is invested in their futures, cares about their financial well-being, and I think that pays dividends not only for the participants but for the business as well.
Yep. Okay. A couple more for you. One was came up in the case study with the ESG fund inclusion. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on the implications of that, or any friction of incorporating ESG-centric funds with a potential, not always, but potential performance and cost implications, and any friction that might exist between there and a fiduciary duty to a participant?
Sure. Yeah, so let's start with cost. And I think the question is probably alluding to the idea that an ESG fund might be more costly than another fund. Let's just assume that. remember, when it comes to fees and costs, they need to be reasonable, right? And if you're a fiduciary and you go through a common sense due diligence process like we talked about, and you document why you're including that ESG fund and the fact that it may have higher fees, but based on participant population or XYZ reasons you're including it, well, that's, I think, you're checking your fiduciary box. So as long as you go through that process and you document why you're adding that fund, then you should be okay, right? Regarding the performance of the fund, there are some studies out there that say that ESG funds actually perform better than normal funds. There are studies that say the opposite. What's interesting with the fiduciary aspect of this is in a lot of other countries, Australia, for example, they're saying that plan sponsors have a fiduciary duty to look at funds and look at investments and judge or determine how a natural disaster or some sort of event might affect the value of that fund. So many around the world are seeing that as a fiduciary duty, and that kind of leads them down the road of choosing investments that are ESG orientated. But overall, when it comes to fiduciary duty and how and why we select funds that go into the plan menu, I think it's important for plan sponsors to remember that if they go through a process, they follow that process, they document that they followed the process and the reasons why they made the choices they did, whether it's an ESG fund or any other fund, then that, I think, is going to help them meet their fiduciary responsibility.
Okay, great. And last one for you, related to the participant findings, clear decrease in trust and satisfaction. Was there any potential source of that was cited that the folks on the phone might use to come up with solutions to that? Like, did it get into why that trust and satisfaction has eroded at all?
Let's see. I think participants, let me think about that and think back to the study. One of the reasons was participants didn't feel that employers or those providers had their best interest at heart. So I think that's probably the main issue, is that they didn't feel they had their best interest at heart. So that gets back to the idea of consistently reminding folks that we're offering a retirement plan and we're offering these benefits, and we are here as a plan sponsor and employer to make sure that we help you achieve some level of retirement success, whatever that looks like to you. So I think that's one of the main points that I remember from the study. So again, it gets back to that idea of how can we remind participants of what we're giving them and how they can take advantage of it and why we're doing what we're doing every day when it comes to the retirement plan.
Appreciate that. Well, that does it for today. Thank you very much, Ben, for sharing the Janus Henderson insight, and thanks to all who stuck with us here till the end. Appreciate your time and hope to see you on the next Epic Insight webinar. Thank you all.
Thanks all. Have a good day.